Humans have existed for at least 300,000 years. Much of that time we have spent on this planet is a mystery, with no written records to refer to. Unless some evidence in the future comes to light, the dawn of human civilization began at around 10,000 BC. Societies, cities, cultures, mathematics, and writing stemmed from our sudden development from hunter-gatherers to farmers and builders. In this series, I'm going to look at each millennium from 10,000 BC to modern day and examine the major events that shaped who we are today. Today, we are starting all the way back from 10,000 to 9,000 BC. So without further ado, let's begin. The period from 10,000 to 9,000 BC represents a massive leap forward in human history, often described as the dawn of the Neolithic Revolution. This millennium, nestled at the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene epoch, witnessed significant changes in human lifestyles, social structures, and relationships with the environment. Humanity transitioned from predominantly nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to the earliest experiments with sedentism, agriculture, and domestication. These developments, unevenly distributed across regions, laid the groundwork for the complex societies that would emerge in subsequent millennia. The period from 10,000 to 9,000 BC coincided with the end of the last glacial maximum and the onset of the Holocene, a warmer and more stable climatic phase. The retreat of glaciers and the expansion of temperate zones reshaped ecosystems, creating fertile landscapes conducive to human settlement. In the Near East, the Fertile Crescent, a region stretching from the Levant to Mesopotamia, benefited from increased rainfall and the proliferation of wild cereals like wheat and barley. Similarly, regions in East Asia, such as the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys, saw growth of wild rice populations. These environmental changes provided abundant resources, enabling human populations to experiment with new ways of life. However, the transition was not uniform. The Younger Dryas, a brief cold snap around 10,800 to 9,600 BC, temporarily disrupted warming trends in some regions, stressing human populations and possibly accelerating the shift towards food production as a buffer against scarcity. In contrast, areas like sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Americas remained heavily reliant on hunting and gathering, as local ecosystems did not yet support domestication. The interplay between climate and human adaptation was thus a defining feature of this period, shaping divergent trajectories across the globe. One of the most significant developments between 10,000 and 9,000 BC was the emergence of semi-permanent and permanent settlements, particularly in the Fertile Crescent. Sites like Jericho in the Levant and Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey provide evidence of early sedentism. Jericho, inhabited by the Natufian culture, featured stone structures and evidence of communal storage, suggesting a community that relied on abundant wild resources, including cereals and game. Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental T-shaped pillars adorned with intricate carvings, challenges traditional narratives as it appears to have been a ritual centre built by hunter-gatherers before widespread agriculture. This suggests that cultural or religious motivations may have driven sedentism, in some cases, rather than purely economic ones. These early settlements were small, often housing a few hundred people, but they marked a departure from the mobile lifestyles of early Paleolithic groups. Sedentism allowed for greater investment in place, such as the construction of durable shelters and storage facilities, and fostered social complexity. However, not all regions adopted sedentism. In areas like the Eurasian steppes or the Australian interior, nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyles persisted, tailored to local environments where mobility remained advantageous. The period from 10,000 to 9,000 BC is often associated with the origins of agriculture, though full-fledged farming systems were not yet widespread. In the Fertile Crescent, the Natufians and their successors began cultivating wild cereals such as einkorn, wheat, and barley, and managing wild herds of goats and sheep. Archaeological evidence from sites like Abu Hararia in Syria show a gradual shift from harvesting wild grains to intentional planting, with morphologically domesticated seeds appearing by around 9000 BC. This process was slow and experimental, driven by a combination of environmental pressures and human innovation. In East Asia, particularly the Yangtze River Valley, early cultivation of wild rice is dated to this period, though domestication was not complete until later. In the Americas, proto-agricultural practices such as the management of plants like squash emerged in regions like Mesoamerica, but hunting and gathering remained dominant. Animal domestication also began in the Near East, with goats and sheep showing signs of human management by 9000 BC, as evidenced by changes in bone morphology at sites like Zawi Chemi, Shanidar. The shift to food production had profound implications. It allowed for greater food security and population growth, but also introduced new challenges such as labour-intensive cultivation, soil depletion, and dependence on specific crops. These early experiments set the stage for agricultural economies that would define the Neolithic. Technological advancements between 10,000 and 9000 BC supported the transition to sedentism and food production. The development of ground stone tools, such as querns and mortars, facilitated the processing of grains as seen at Natufan sites. Sickle blades, often made from flint with glossy edges from cutting grasses, indicate harvesting activities. These tools reflect a growing specialization in food procurement and preparation. Architecture also evolved, with the construction of stone and mud brick structures at sites like Jericho, the use of plaster for floors and walls, as well as the creation of storage pits, points to increased investment in permanent settlements. At Göbekli Tepe, the carving and erection of massive limestone pillars demonstrate advanced stoneworking skills and communal labour organisation, suggesting that technological innovation extended beyond subsistence to cultural expression. In regions where hunter-gatherer lifestyles persisted, technologies like microliths, small, versatile stone tools, remained prevalent. In coastal areas, such as the Jomon culture in Japan, early pottery emerged, used for cooking and storage, marking another technological milestone. These innovations, while regionally specific, collectively highlight humanity's adaptability during this period. The shift to sedentism and early agriculture reshaped social structures. In hunter-gatherer societies, small egalitarian bands were common, with flexible leadership based on skill or experience. In contrast, early sedentary communities, such as those in the Fertile Crescent, show signs of increasing social complexity. The construction of communal structures, like the towers at Jericho or the sanctuaries at Göbekli Tepe, suggests collective labour and possibly emerging hierarchies or specialised roles such as ritual leaders. Kinship likely remained the primary organising principle, with extended families forming the core of new settlements. However, the storage of surplus food and the control of resources may have introduced new social dynamics, including competition or inequality. Burial practices, such as the Natufian custom of interring individuals with grave goods, indicate status differentiation in some communities, though evidence of rigid hierarchies is limited. Gender roles during this period are less clear, but likely varied by region. Ethnographic analogies suggest that women played significant roles in gathering and early plant cultivation, while men may have focused on hunting or herding. The labour demands of sedentism, such as building and processing food, likely required cooperation across genders, fostering interdependence within communities. This millennium also saw rich cultural expressions, particularly in the Fertile Crescent. Göbekli Tepe's elaborately carved pillars depicting animals, humans, and abstract symbols suggest a complex cosmology, possibly centered on ritual or communal identity. These structures indicate that symbolic behavior was not just a byproduct of agriculture, but a driving force in social organization. Artistic expression also flourished in other forms. Natufian sites yield small figurines, often of animals or humans, and decorated tools, reflecting a growing emphasis on aesthetics and meaning. Cave art, while less prominent than in the Upper Paleolithic, continued in regions like Europe, with engravings and paintings depicting local fauna. Burial practices provide further insight into cultural beliefs. The Natufians practiced secondary burials, removing skulls and sometimes decorating them, suggesting ancestor veneration or spiritual connections to the dead. These practices hint at a worldview that linked the living with the supernatural, a trait shared with later Neolithic cultures. In regions where hunter-gatherer lifestyles persisted, cultural practices were often tied to mobility and the landscape. For example, the Jomon in Japan created pottery with cord-marked designs, possibly reflecting group identity or ritual use. These are just some examples of the creativity and adaptability of human societies during this period. While the Fertile Crescent led the way in sedentism and agriculture, other regions followed distinct paths. In East Asia, early rice cultivation laid the foundation for later agricultural societies, but hunting and gathering remained prevalent. In sub-Saharan Africa, mobile hunter-gatherer groups exploited diverse ecosystems, with no evidence of domestication during this period. In the Americas, groups like those in the Andes and Mesoamerica began managing plants, but their economies remained mixed. Europe, still recovering from the Ice Age, saw hunter-gatherer communities adapting to forested environments, with sites like Starcar in England revealing sophisticated use of resources like deer and fish. In Australia, Aboriginal groups maintained a nomadic lifestyle, with complex oral traditions and land management practices that preempted later developments. These regional variations put a spotlight on the diversity of human adaptations, driven by local environments and cultural priorities. The Neolithic Revolution, while transformative, was not a global phenomenon by 9000 BC, but its seeds were sown in key regions. The transition from a hunter-gatherer society to farming and agriculture brought challenges. Settled communities faced risks like disease from living in close proximity and reliance on limited food sources, which could lead to malnutrition if crops failed. The Younger Dryas may have exacerbated these risks, pushing communities to innovate or revert to mobility. Social tensions also emerged. The control of surplus resources could lead to disputes, and the labour demands of building and farming strained communal cohesion. In some cases, as at Göbekli Tepe, ritual centres may have served to unify groups, but they also required significant resources, potentially straining smaller communities. The period from 10,000 to 9000 BC was a spark for human innovation. The experiments with sedentism, agriculture, and domestication laid the foundation for the Neolithic societies that followed, leading to urbanization, writing, and complex civilizations. The cultural and technological achievements of this period, from monumental architecture to symbolic art, reveals a species grappling with new possibilities and challenges. This millennium also underscores humanity's diverging paths. While some groups embraced sedentism, others thrived as hunter-gatherers, demonstrating that there was no single path to progress. The legacy of this period is not only in the technologies or economies at birth, but in the enduring human capacity to adapt, create, and imagine new ways of living. The millennium of 9000 to 8000 BC served only to speed up these changes that had already begun. This era, often associated with the transition from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic in various regions, saw significant developments in human societies driven by climatic stability, technological innovation, and social changes. Unlike the preceding millennium, which included the tail end of the Younger Dryas cold snap, the period from 9000 to 8000 BC benefited from a warmer, more stable climate that fostered new subsistence strategies and cultural practices. In this video, we will examine the major events and technological breakthroughs for humans during this time frame. This was a time where on each part of our planet, humans started diversifying greatly in our behaviours, creating new adaptations to take advantage of our surroundings and thrive. I will focus on each part of the world and the progress made in these areas. So, without any more preamble, let's get into it. By 9000 BC, the Earth was firmly in the Holocene, with the climatic fluctuations of the Younger Dryas behind it. The period from 9000 to 8000 BC saw continued warming, with temperatures stabilising and precipitation patterns supporting the growth of diverse ecosystems. In the Fertile Crescent, encompassing parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Turkey, fertile soils and reliable water sources nurtured wild cereals such as wheat and barley, and legumes, creating ideal conditions for human exploitation. In Europe, rising sea levels reshaped coastlines, submerging low-lying areas and forming modern features like the Baltic Sea. In Asia, warming climates expanded forests and grasslands, while in the Americas, the extinction of the megafauna forced hunter-gatherers to target smaller game and plant resources. This stable climate was critical, as it provided predictable resources and encouraged experimentation with plant and animal management. The absence of major climatic disruptions during this millennium allowed human populations to focus on long-term strategies, setting the stage for the societal changes that were to come. In Europe, the Mesolithic period, broadly around 10,000 to 5000 BC, saw hunter-gatherers adapt to post-glacial forests and coastlines. From 9000 to 8000 BC, communities exploited diverse resources, remaining largely mobile but showing signs of semi-sedentism in resource-rich areas. Residents hunted deer, gathered hazelnuts, and fished, using microlith-tipped arrows and bone tools. In the Balkans, Lepenski Vir in Serbia emerged by 8000 BC as a semi-permanent fishing village along the Danube. Trapezoidal houses and fish-shaped stone sculptures indicate cultural complexity and attachment to a place. In Scandinavia, the Ertebal culture, emerging around 8000 BC, relied on coastal resources, using nets, weirs, and dugout canoes for fishing and seal hunting. Shell middens, like those at Skateholm in Sweden, reveal intensive marine exploration. Technologically, microliths dominated, forming composite tools for hunting and harvesting. Flint axes, used for woodworking, appear at sites like Vadbeke in Denmark. The bow and arrow, likely preceding this millennium, now became widespread and was used for hunting and even warfare. Art, such as rock engravings in Norway depicting animals, reflects cultural continuity. Socially, burials with grave goods, such as amber beads at Skateholm, suggest emerging status differentiation. While agriculture was absent, intensive foraging laid the groundwork for later Neolithic adoption. In East Asia, particularly China, this period saw early experimentation with plant management and technological innovation. The Yangtze River Basin, with its fertile wetlands, supported wild rice. At Kwahukou in China, dated to around 8000 BC, phytoliths and charred rice grains indicate managed wild rice, a precursor to domestication. Residents used wooden spades and bone tools for cultivation, suggesting semi-sedentary practices near reliable water sources. Technological breakthroughs included early pottery, among the world's oldest. At Jianrendong Cave in China, pottery shards dated to around 8000 BC, with simple cord-mark designs were used for cooking and storage. This innovation, absent in the Middle East at this time, enhanced food processing and supported semi-sedentary life. Stone tools like grinding slabs at Pengushan processed nuts and seeds. Culturally, East Asian communities showed the beginnings of complexity. Burials at Jihou, later but rooted in this period, included turtle shells, possibly for divination. Socially, semi-permanent settlements imply cooperative labour, though hierarchies were minimal. These developments positioned East Asia as a secondary centre of agricultural origins, distinct from the Middle East. In South Asia, the site of Mehrgarh shows significant development. By around 8000 BC, Mehrgarh's inhabitants cultivated wild barley and wheat, with evidence of mud brick houses suggesting semi-sedentism. Dental wear on human remains indicates grain processing, while storage pits point to surplus management. Early domestication of goats, likely influenced by Zagros practices, appears by early 8000 BC, evidenced by bone morphology. The main technologies found in this area are microliths and groundstone tools that supported harvesting and grinding. Bone tools like awls indicate hide processing. Culturally, shell beads and simple ornaments suggest aesthetic expression, while burials show minimal grave goods implying egalitarian social structures. Mehrgar's proximity to the Middle East facilitated cultural exchange, but its trajectory was shaped by local monsoon-driven ecosystems, distinguishing it from the Fertile Crescent models. In Africa, the Sahara, which at the time was a lush savanna due to stronger monsoons, supported vibrant human populations. In this period, Nabta Playa in Egypt was a key site, with seasonal camps near the Playa Lake. By 8000 BC, evidence of cattle management, possibly early domestication, appears in the form of young cattle bones, suggesting controlled herds. This marks one of the earliest instances of pastoralism, predating widespread agriculture in the region. Residents gathered wild sorghum and millets, using grinding stones and microliths. Pottery, among Africa's earliest, appears at Nabta Playa by 8000 BC and was used for cooking. Stone circles and tumuli suggest ritual practices, possibly tied to seasonal gatherings. Socially, the need to manage herds implies cooperative strategies, though evidence of hierarchies is scarce. Sub-Saharan Africa, less studied for this period, likely saw mobile foraging, with sites like Unjugu showing wild millet use. In the Americas, the period followed the extinction of the megafauna, forcing hunter-gatherers to diversify. At this time period, communities in the Andes, Mesoamerica, and North America intensified wild resource use, a precursor to later domestication. In the Andes, sites like Guitarrero Cave in Peru yield evidence of wild bean and chili pepper collection by 8000 BC, alongside hunting of deer and camelids. Grinding stones indicate plant processing. In Mesoamerica, the Tehucan Valley in Mexico shows extensive gathering of avocados, squash, and grasses, with seasonal camps suggesting mobility. North America's Great Basin saw hunter-gatherers exploit nuts and small game, using atlatls and microliths. Technologically, basketry and cordage, preserved in dry caves, supported storage and transport. Culturally, rock art in the southwest depicts hunting scenes, while burials with tools suggest spiritual beliefs. Socially, egalitarian bands predominated, with seasonal gatherings fostering exchange. In Australia, Aboriginal populations adapted to diverse ecosystems, from arid interiors to coastal zones. Rising sea levels separated Tasmania, shaping coastal economies. Sites like Puritjara in Central Australia show microlith use for hunting kangaroos and processing seeds. Coastal middens, such as those at Bribie Island, reveal shellfish and fish exploitation. Boomerangs and ground edge axes also enhanced hunting efficiency. Grinding stones processed wild grains like panicum, hinting at intensive plant use. Rock art at sites like Arnhem Land depicts animals and spirits, reflecting complex cosmologies. Kinship-based groups maintained extensive trade networks, exchanging ochre and tools. Mobility, though, remains central, with no evidence of sedentism or agriculture. The period from 9000 to 8000 BC was a dynamic era of human adaptation, with the Middle East pioneering sedentism and agriculture, while regions outside Europe, East Asia, South Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Australia developed sophisticated foraging, early plant and animal management, and cultural systems. Europe's Mesolithic communities thrived on diverse resources. East Asia innovated with pottery and rice. South Asia paralleled Middle Eastern agriculture. Africa pioneered pastoralism. The Americas intensified foraging, and Australia refined mobile economies. These regional variations show us the spirit of human resilience and creativity, laying diverse foundations for later social complexity. The millennium spanning 8000 to 7000 BC stands as one of the most transformative periods in human history. It was an era not defined by the rise and fall of empires or the clash of great armies, but by a more profound elemental shift, the widespread adoption, consolidation, and refinement of agriculture, the process often termed the Neolithic Revolution. While the initial experiments in plant and animal domestication began in the preceding millennia, this specific 1000-year window witnessed these practices become more firmly established and central to the subsistence of many communities, particularly in the Fertile Crescent. This transition laid the critical groundwork for the development of larger, permanent villages, new technologies, evolving social structures, and ultimately, the civilizations that would follow. The Fertile Crescent was at the vanguard, but distinct, often independent agricultural stirrings and significant cultural developments were also occurring elsewhere, heralding a new chapter in the human story, specifically within this time frame. In this video, we will cover some of the major events of this millennium, how it was influenced by the past, and how it further affected the future. This is the third part in the series, so if you haven't already checked out the previous two, I will leave links in the description. Now with all of that out of the way, let's get into it. The most significant development consolidated within this millennium was the intensification of agriculture. In the Fertile Crescent, by 8000 BC, communities were not just experimenting, but were systematically cultivating emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, peas, and chickpeas. Sites like Abu Huraira in Syria provide crucial evidence. Its Natufian inhabitants, which were pre-8000 BC, were hunter-gatherers, but by the early part of this millennium, the site shows clear evidence of established farming and domesticated cereals. Similarly, at Jericho, layers dating squarely between 8000 and 7000 BC reveal cultivated cereals. This cuts through two significant civilizational timelines. The pre-pottery Neolithic is divided into pre-pottery Neolithic A or PPNA, which was from 10,000 to 8,800 BC, and the following pre-pottery Neolithic B or PPNB, which was 8,800 to 6,500 BC. The selection for traits like tougher stems in cereals, which prevent premature seed scattering and are a hallmark of domestication, became more pronounced. For animal domestication, while goats and sheep were tamed earlier, their management and economic importance solidified during this millennium. Evidence from sites like Ganj Dareh in Iran around 7900 BC shows some of the earliest signs of goat domestication morphologically. By the mid-8th millennium BC, domesticated forms of sheep and goats were common across the Near East. The domestication of cattle and pigs began to take hold towards the end of this period, with sites like Catuluic, founded in 7500 BC, eventually showing evidence for cattle in a domestic context, though the process was likely still in its earlier stages within the specific millennium of these larger species. This increasingly reliable agricultural package directly enabled population growth and a more permanent settlement. The shift towards agriculture had profound and immediate implications for human settlement patterns within this millennium. Jericho provides a dramatic example. A famous stone tower, wall, and ditch are dated to the PPNA period, specifically around 8000 BC. This monumental construction, requiring significant communal labour, occurred right at the beginning of our focal millennium, signifying a major step in societal organisation for these early agriculturists. The settlement itself, with its round oval mud brick houses, was a substantial village. As we move into the PPNB period, starting around 7500 BC, house forms in the Levant often transitioned to rectangular structures, a change visible at Jericho and other sites like Ain Ghazal, founded in 7250 BC in Jordan. In Anatolia, a sickly Hoyuk was occupied from approximately 8200 to 7400 BC, showing a densely packed village of rectangular mud-bricked buildings, demonstrating a long-term, stable settlement reliant on agriculture and animal husbandry through much of this millennium. The initial occupation of Çatalhöyük around 7500 to 7400 BC also falls squarely within this period, quickly growing into a large, distinctive settlement of interconnected mud brick houses accessed from rooftops. These were not ephemeral camps, but established villages, centres of the new agricultural way of life. Technological innovation specific to or significantly advancing within this period was also crucial. While ground stone tools were used earlier, their variety and sophistication increased. Polished stone axes and adzes became more common and essential for clearing land and working wood for the increasingly substantial rectangular houses of the PPNB. Sickle blades, often made of flint and hafted for harvesting cereals, are abundant in sites from this period. Grinding stones like querns and pestles are hallmark artifacts of these agricultural communities, essential for processing grain. A major technological leap was the widespread adoption and development of pottery. Though true fired pottery appears more consistently towards the middle and the end of this millennium in many Near Eastern sites. For example, the pottery Neolithic generally begins after 7000 BC in the Levant, but the preceding PPNB period saw the extensive use of whiteware, vessels made of lime plaster, which can be seen as a precursor technology. However, in regions like southern Anatolia and upper Mesopotamia, early ceramic traditions were emerging. For instance, the site of Tel Sabi Abyad in Syria shows evidence of some of the earliest pottery in the Near East, around 6900 to 6800 BC. Early weaving is also evidenced by impressions of textiles on clay and finds of spindle whorls on sites dated to this millennium, indicating the production of linen from flax. The Near East and Anatolia were undeniably the heartland for these Neolithic transformations. The decline and final abandonment of the hunter-gatherer ritual centre of Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BC is a highly significant event, marking the start of this millennium, symbolising a shift away from large-scale hunter-gatherer communal ritualism. In its place, the ritual life of the new agricultural villages, as seen in the PPNB period, focused more on household-based practices, ancestor veneration, and fertility, evidenced by numerous human and animal figurines. The increasing size of settlements like Ain Ghazal, which grew to be a mega-site by the end of this millennium, points to successful adaptation but also to emerging social complexities in managing larger populations. While the Near East was advancing rapidly, Europe was still largely in the Mesolithic. However, the very beginning of the Neolithic expansion into Europe occurred at the tail end of this millennium. Around 7000 BC, the first farming communities appeared in parts of Greece, and it also shows an introduction of domesticated sheep and goats and cereals around this time, and sites like Sesklo and Nea Nicomedia were established. This was not a widespread European phenomenon yet, but the initial crucial step of the agricultural package, wheat, barley, sheep and goats arriving from Anatolia, marking a pivotal moment in future European development. This millennium in East Asia was critical for the independent development of agriculture. In North China, sites associated with the Pelusiang and Xishan culture show clear evidence for the cultivation of foxtail and broomcorn millet. Jiahu in the Huai River Valley is particularly remarkable, with evidence of domesticated rice, early pottery, and possibly the earliest playable musical instruments made from bone flutes. There was also proto-writing symbols on tortoise shells, all dating to the very end of this millennium or just after. In the Yangtze River Basin, sites like Pengtushan continued to show evidence of rice cultivation and distinctive cord-marked pottery. The societal consequences of the shifts in our culture became more apparent during this millennium. While early villages may have maintained largely egalitarian structures, the management of stored surpluses, organisation of communal labour for significant projects like Jericho's fortifications, and the defence of resources likely began to foster rudimentary forms of leadership or social ranking. The health impacts also started to manifest. Studies from skeleton remains from PPNB sites sometimes show evidence of increased infectious disease loads and dental issues associated with agricultural diets. Spiritually and culturally, the shift from hunter-gatherer cosmologies to those more tuned to agricultural cycles and settled life solidified. The intramural burials and plastered skulls found at sites like Jericho, Beta and Ain Ghazal, dating firmly within the PPNB period, highlight a strong emphasis on ancestors and community continuity tied to a place. The proliferation of human figurines, particularly female ones, in PPNB context suggests focus on fertility and lineage. The millennium between 8000 and 7000 BC was a period of accelerated change for humanity, particularly in the Fertile Crescent, where the Neolithic package was consolidated and elaborated on. Key events include the construction of Jericho's tower and walls, the flourishing of PPNA and early PPNB culture with its distinctive rectangular architecture and emerging ritual practices, the establishment of significant early agricultural villages like Askli-Hoyuk and the initial phases of Katla-Hoyuk, the clear domestication of key cereals and primary livestock, the beginnings of the Neolithic expansion into Europe, and the independent consolidation of millet and early rice agriculture in China. It signified a critical intensification and spread of the Neolithic Revolution, fundamentally altering how many human societies procured food, organised themselves, and interacted with their environment, laying the direct foundations for subsequent societal complexity. The period between 7000 and 6000 BC often gets overlooked. There was of course further progress in agriculture, but if we only focus on farming, we miss out on a lot of amazing things humans were accomplishing all over the world. It was a period when people who had learned to survive after the last ice age started trying out new ways to live, work together, and even fight. They were building the groundwork for the complicated societies we see today. Away from the farms, people were building, creating, moving to new places, and were sometimes in conflict with each other. The world was still mostly wild, but humans were starting to leave their mark. This millennium saw significant global environmental shifts. Around 6200 to 6000 BC, the 8.2 kiloyear event occurred. This was a sudden and sharp drop in global temperatures, likely caused by the final massive melting of the Laurentide ice sheet in North America, which poured huge amounts of cold freshwater into the North Atlantic. This event had far-reaching effects, leading to drier conditions in places like East Africa and Mesopotamia, which would have put stress on emerging settled communities and their resources. Following this, between 6200 and 5600 BC, there was a rapid rise in sea level. The global sea level increased by about 6.5 meters in less than 140 years. This dramatic rise marked the end of the rapid sea level increases that had been happening since the last ice age, with sea levels remaining largely stable afterwards. This sudden change would have reshaped coastlines, flooded low-lying areas, and forced coastal communities to adapt or move. This apocalyptic event is theorized to have inspired the great flood stories that appear in many religious texts that came after. The area known as the Fertile Crescent is famous for being where farming began. It should be noted though that the Fertile Crescent had a much wetter, greener climate in this millennium than we know today. This period saw settled life growing in many ways, and cultures became much more complex. In a place called Catalhoyuk in Turkey, a huge early town grew. Thousands of people lived in houses made of mud bricks, packed tightly together. They were entered through holes in the roof, making the town look like a beehive with no streets. Even though they grew some crops, they still ate a lot of wild plants and animals. The people of Catalhoyuk were master craftsmen. They made tools from black volcanic glass known as obsidian. They made elaborate woven cloths and also advanced pottery. Their homes were decorated with bright paintings and clay sculptures of animals, hunting scenes, and patterns. This tells us they had rich beliefs and spiritual lives. The size of Catalhoyuk and how long people lived there suggests they worked together in harmony and had found effective ways of organising their society, even if we fully don't understand how they were governed. The people of the Near East, especially at sites like Catalhoyuk, showed a deep connection to their environment and ancestors. They practiced elaborate burial rituals, often burying their dead beneath the floors in their houses, suggesting a strong link between the living and the deceased. Their art, particularly the wall paintings and figurines, often featured animals like bulls and leopards, as well as female figures, which might have represented deities or important ancestral spirits. In West Asia, this period also saw the early development of proto-literate cuneiform. These were not full writing systems yet, but early forms of symbols and marks used for record keeping, possibly for trade or tracking goods. This shows a growing need for more organised ways to manage information in increasingly complex societies. Further south, The town of Jericho in the Middle East continued its long history. It was known for its huge stone tower and wall built even earlier. During this time, Jericho stayed an important place. Its walls may have been for protection from floods or as a symbol of their community, rather than just protection from other tribes. More and more people in the Near East started using pottery during this 1,000-year period. This was a big step forward because it made storing, cooking, and preparing food much easier, helping people to stay in one place. Evidence of habitation at the current site of Aleppo dates to around 6000 BC. This indicates that the area, which would later become one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, was already a significant settlement. Furthermore, carbon-14 dating at Tel Ramad near Damascus suggests occupation possibly around 6300 BC, building on even earlier evidence of settlement of the wider Barada basin dating back to 9000 BC. The long history of these sites highlights a continuous human presence and adaptation in the region, even through environmental changes. The drier conditions caused by the 8.2 kiloyear event would have posed new challenges for these settled communities, requiring adaptation in their water management and resource strategies, perhaps by developing new irrigation techniques or relying more on drought-resistant crops. However, this time of growing settlements wasn't always peaceful. Digs at sites like Tel Sabi Abiyad in Syria from the late 7th millennium BC shows signs of sudden destruction and people leaving their homes. This suggests there were times of fighting. While we don't find much direct proof of conflicts, bones found on some sites sometimes have old breaks or new injuries from fights between people. This means arguments, raids, or fights over land were a sad part of life in these growing, resource-rich communities. When groups started gathering more possessions and claiming specific areas, it could easily have led to these conflicts. In Europe, this period was mostly about different Mesolithic cultures which were thriving. From cold Scandinavia to the warm Mediterranean, these hunter-gatherers were far from simple. They made very specific tools for fishing, hunting, and gathering, including clever tools from bone and deer antlers, tiny sharp flint tools, and early types of boats. Groups living inland managed forests, hunted large game, and gathered many different plant foods. They knew their local environment very well. A fascinating development around 7000 BC was a large-scale fish fermentation facility in southern Sweden. This sophisticated method of food preservation allows communities to store surplus fish for longer periods, providing a reliable source even when fresh catches were scarce. It indicates a deep understanding of food chemistry and a complex approach to managing resources, enabling greater sedentism and larger populations. The culture of Mesolithic Europe was deeply tied to their natural surroundings. Their art, often found on small portable objects or in rock shelters, depicted animals, human figures, and abstract patterns, reflecting their spiritual connection to the hunt and the wild. Burial practices varied but often included grave goods, suggesting beliefs in the afterlife or the importance of the deceased. These groups also developed strong oral traditions, passing down knowledge of hunting, foraging, and their history through stories and songs, creating a rich, non-material culture that bound communities together. In Southeast Europe around 6000 BC, we also see the development of Vinca symbols, an early form of proto-writing. These enigmatic symbols, found on pottery and figurines, suggest a system of communication or record keeping that predates formal writing. pointing to a growing complexity in social organisation and symbolic thought. But during this time, farming ideas from the Near East slowly started to move into southeastern Europe. This wasn't a fast takeover, but a gradual spread of ideas, tools, and maybe small groups of people who brought new ways of living with them. Often these new ways were used alongside the old hunter-gatherer ways, rather than replacing them right away. This sharing of cultures, though it can change things a lot in the long run, was probably complicated and not always peaceful. The aforementioned rapid sea level rise would also have significantly altered coastal environments, impacting fishing grounds and coastal settlements for these groups. Many coastal areas would have been submerged, forcing communities to relocate inland or adapt their subsistence strategies to new shorelines. There is also clear evidence of fighting in Mesolithic Europe. The Offnet Cave in Germany has a mass burial from this period. There, 33 people, mostly women and children, were found with serious head injuries, suggesting a brutal killing. Similarly, in Germany, bones show several people had sharp points such as arrowheads stuck into them. These findings, along with signs that some settlements were built for defense, suggest that violence between groups, perhaps over good hunting or fishing spots, or even kidnapping, was a harsh reality of these adaptable societies. Areas where Mesolithic and early farming groups met could have also been places where conflicts flared up, as their different ways of acquiring food and claiming land clashed. In East Asia, the 7th millennium BC was a time of new inventions, especially in making pottery and starting settled communities. In Japan, the Jamon culture were already well established. They made some of the world's oldest and most detailed pottery, often with intricate designs. This pottery wasn't just useful, it was very artistic, showing they had a refined sense of beauty. The Jamon people mainly hunted, gathered, and fished, using the rich resources of the Japanese islands and the many plants and animals in their forests. Their settlements, sometimes quite large, show that they lived in one place more than many hunter-gatherer groups, thanks to a steady supply of different foods. The Jamon culture of Japan is particularly known for its spiritual and artistic depth. They created unique clay figurines called dogu, often with exaggerated features, which are thought to have ritual or magical purposes, perhaps related to fertility or protection. They also produced elaborate ear ornaments and other personal adornments. Their settlements sometimes included stone circles and other ceremonial structures, indicating organized spiritual practices and a complex understanding of the cosmos. This rich material culture reflects a sophisticated belief system and a strong sense of community identity among the Jamon people. This period was a very important time for North Africa, especially the Sahara Desert area. Back then, it was a green Sahara, or a wet period for Africa. This meant the climate was much wetter, turning huge desert areas into grasslands, savannas, and places with lakes and rivers. This change in environment allowed many people to live there, expanding hunter-gatherer groups into areas that are now harsh deserts. The drier conditions caused by the 8.2 kiloyear event would have gradually begun to impact this region towards the end of the millennium, foreshadowing the eventual desertification. This would have put pressure on water sources and grazing lands, potentially leading to increased competition among groups. The cultural life in the Green Sahara was vividly expressed through rock art, which is found in numerous sites across the region. These paintings and engravings depict not only the diverse wildlife of the area, but also human activities like hunting, dancing, and early scenes of cattle herding. This art provides insights into their spiritual beliefs, often showing masked figures or animals with symbolic meanings. The development of pottery, sometimes with decorated or intricate patterns, also points to a growing sense of artistic expression and distinct cultural identities among these groups, who adapted ingeniously to their changing environment. Across the huge continents of North and South America, the 7th millennium BC falls within the Archaic period. This was a time with very different and advanced hunter-gatherer fisher societies adapted to all sorts of environments after the Ice Age. Unlike the Old World, where farming spread widely, the Americas saw different and independent ways for people to settle down more and manage resources. In North America's eastern woodlands, communities started to grow local plants like squash and gourds. These weren't main food sources, but extra food for containers. This was a very slow process of taming plants rather than a sudden farming revolution. It showed they knew a lot about nature and were practical about producing more food. Making groundstone tools and early baskets also happened during this time, meaning they were better at preparing and storing different resources. Archaic peoples across the Americas developed diverse spiritual practices and artistic traditions, often reflecting their close relationship with the land and its resources. They created portable art, such as carved bone or stone objects, and rock art in various regions, depicting animals, human-like figures, and abstract symbols that likely held deep meaning. Further south in Central America and the Andes Mountains, similar plant taming was happening, focusing on local plants like chili peppers, avocados, and various root vegetables. The creation of more permanent main camps and places where groups gathered at certain times of the year suggests growing societal complexity and the development of unique cultural styles in different regions. The 1,000 years between 7,000 and 6,000 BC were much more than just a continuation of the before. It was a lively picture of human cleverness and the ability to adapt. All over the world, different societies were finding their own new paths, driven by changes in the environment, new tools, and changing social groups. From the unique town life of Catalahoyuk to the strong hunter-gatherers of Europe, the artistic potters of Jamon in Japan, and the first animal herders of the Green Sahara, and the adaptable archaic people of the Americas, humans were exploring many ways to live well and survive. However, alongside all of this amazing progress, the seeds of conflict were also being planted. The very things that defined this era, staying in one place, gathering more resources, developing unique group identities, and claiming territories, naturally brought new reasons for conflict. This era was a time of huge change, where humanity not only changed its surroundings, but also, in doing so, started to change its relationship with each other, both working together and fighting. It was a clear sign of humanity's lasting ability to invent, to bounce back, and sadly, to fight, as it entered a new age. The stretch of history between 6,000 and 5,000 BC is often treated as a quiet bridge between the invention of farming and the rise of the first cities. But in reality, this period was anything but dull. It was a time of radical change, experimentation, and creativity in human societies. Across multiple continents, people were trying entirely new ways of thinking, building, and organising life. These weren't just incremental improvements, they were fresh ideas that never existed before. From astronomical observations in the Sahara to the first attempts at metal smelting in Europe, and from proto-writing symbols to medical drilling of teeth, Humans in this era were innovating in ways that would ripple forward for thousands of years. This video explores the most distinctive and groundbreaking events from that transformative millennium. In the valleys and hills of modern-day Serbia, an extraordinary cultural development began around 5500 BC with the Vinca culture. These people were among the earliest in the world to discover how to extract metal from stone, an innovation that would eventually reshape all of human society. At the site of Plosnik, archaeologists uncovered a set of clay furnaces capable of reaching the high temperatures required to smelt copper ore. The furnaces were cleverly designed with airflow systems, and nearby slag and crucibles suggest that actual copper tools were being produced, not just hammered cold from native metal, but melted, shaped, and refined. This leap into metallurgy was not borrowed from older traditions. It originated in southeastern Europe during this exact time. The people of the Vinca culture also lived in organized settlements, some with thousands of people, complete with streets, kilns, storage buildings, and communal spaces. Their towns represented some of the largest and most advanced Neolithic communities of the time. But perhaps most intriguing is their use of symbols etched into pottery and figurines, often referred to as Vinca script. While not true writing, these marks showed signs of repetition, pattern, and context, suggesting that it may have been used to record ownership, identity, or even early religious ideas. These symbols did not evolve from earlier systems. They began within this period, showing that even without cities or states, people were already experimenting with abstract communication. In the coastal region of Brittany, France, a massive stone structure known as the Barnenez Cairn was built around 4800 BC, making it the oldest known megalithic monument in the world. This vast burial complex was constructed from over 13,000 tons of stone and contains 11 chambered tombs, all enclosed under a mound more than 70 meters long. At a time when most people still lived in small, scattered villages, the construction of such a monument required coordinated labour, engineering knowledge, and strong social cohesion. What's most fascinating is why it was built. These chambered tombs were not just graves, they were likely spiritual centres used for generations. The effort to gather, shape, and place the massive stones would have taken months or years, possibly serving as a unifying project for early communities. Such a massive construction effort points to the presence of ritual specialists, labour divisions, and perhaps even early forms of leadership or hierarchy. Yet all of it happened before writing, before metal tools were widely used, and before traditional rise of states. Barnenez reminds us that monumentality and spiritual architecture didn't begin in Egypt or Mesopotamia, but in small Neolithic communities that decided to honour the dead and the sacred in stone. In the upland valleys of northern Mesopotamia, the Halaf culture emerged around 6000 BC, bringing with it a wave of colourful, finely made ceramics. Unlike earlier pots that were purely functional, Halaf pottery was elaborately decorated with swirling patterns, stylized animals, and geometric shapes painted in red, black, and cream colours. These ceramics were often found in domestic or ritual contexts, indicating they may have played a role in social identity or communal ceremonies. Their craftsmanship required not only advanced firing techniques, but also a sense of aesthetic and symbolic meaning. These decorated vessels weren't isolated artworks. Across the ancient Near East, they were part of a growing trend towards self-expression and symbolic thinking. At the same time, in southeastern Europe, the Vinca people created pottery with incised signs and symbols. Some vessels even combined image and symbol, suggesting an early effort to encode meaning or communicate shared knowledge. These expressions of art and symbolism show that people during this millennium were not simply surviving or farming. They were beginning to tell stories and express values visually, using pottery as a cultural language long before written text existed. In the middle of what is now the Sahara Desert, a remarkable site called Nabta Playa offers evidence of one of the earliest known astronomical monuments in the world. Located in southern Egypt, this area was not desert 7,000 years ago. It was a savanna-like environment dotted with seasonal lakes supporting a population of nomadic herders. Around 5500 BC, these communities began gathering at Nabta Playa to erect large megalithic structures, including stone circles and alignments that point towards the summer solstice sunrise. Unlike later civilizations in the Nile Valley, the people of Nabta were not urban or agricultural in the traditional sense. They moved with their herds and likely gathered at the site during certain seasons, possibly for rituals, trade, or astronomical observations. The stones they placed were carefully arranged, not randomly dropped. Some researchers believe these alignments served as a kind of calendar, helping the community track the changing seasons and possibly predict rainfall patterns. The site also includes burials with grave goods and underground water wells, showing not only spiritual and scientific awareness but also engineering skills and social cooperation. These achievements were not entirely original to that period and show that humans were already developing cosmic awareness, ceremonial life, and monument building traditions, long before pharaohs or pyramids existed. Among the dry plains of Baluchistan in western Pakistan, the site of Mehrgarh holds one of the most surprising discoveries of early human medicine. Around 5500 BC, people living in the settlement were practicing basic dental surgery. In human remains from this period, archaeologists found several teeth that had been drilled with remarkable precision using tiny flint tools. The holes are small, round, and deep, and in some cases the teeth even showed signs of healing, meaning the individuals survived the procedure. This practice, which predates Egyptian or Greek medicine by thousands of years, shows not just technical ability but medical intention. These weren't accidents, they were deliberate treatments for tooth pain or infection. This also suggests that some members of society may have had specialized roles, such as healers or technicians, and that they already had the concept of bodily care and intervention. Mehrgarh is also notable for other developments, including the use of semi-precious stones, shell ornaments, and early trade networks. But it is this evidence of surgery that stands out, an extraordinary example of how humans were already probing the limits of health and healing 6,000 years ago. In the highlands of what is now southeastern Algeria, the vast area known as Tassili Enager became a canvas for one of the world's earliest and most dramatic artistic traditions. Around 5500 BC, during a time when the Sahara was lush with vegetation, lakes, and wildlife, people painted the rock walls of over 15,000 shelters and cliffs with stunning lifelike scenes of daily life, ritual, and mystery. The paintings depict cattle herding, ceremonial dances, masked figures, and stylized animals, often rendered with a level of detail and movement that is rarely seen in early art. Some human figures wear what looks like costumes or ritual gear, leading researchers to believe these paintings captured religious or spiritual events, perhaps ceremonies linked to rain, fertility, or ancestor worship. Others show early herding scenes, indicating new relationships between humans and animals as the environment changed. These murals offer a rare glimpse into the cognitive and cultural world of early Saharan peoples. They were not simply recording events, they were constructing meaning, connecting people, land, animals, and the divine through monumental visual storytelling, thousands of years before the written word. Around 5000 BC, the Yangshao culture rose along the middle reaches of the Yellow River in northern China. This society built planned villages, with circular or rectangular houses organised around central plazas. The presence of surrounding ditches suggests that people were protecting their communities, either from wild animals or rival groups. These weren't random clusters of huts, they were intentional social spaces, reflecting a new kind of community thinking. What makes the Yangshao culture stand out is its painted pottery, decorated with black and red designs on buff coloured clay. Some of the pots depict stylized fish, faces, birds, or abstract lines that may have carried symbolic meanings. A few even contain markings that look like proto-characters, suggesting that these communities were beginning to develop systems of symbolic communication. The Yangshao also left behind burial sites, where people were buried with different types of grave goods depending on age, gender, and status. This points to the rise of social roles and ceremonial behaviour. The Yangshao weren't simply builders or potters, they were early experimenters in identity, symbolism, and community memory. Between 6000 and 5000 BC, human communities around the world were not just learning how to farm, they were reimagining what it was to be human. In every corner of the globe, people were observing the stars, building monuments, experimenting with metal, carving symbols, and even drilling teeth. These weren't slow improvements from earlier eras. They were genuine breakthroughs that first appeared during this specific window of time. This period gave us the first astronomers, engineers, artists, and healers. Not in the cities of later empires, but in small villages, desert camps, and forested valleys. These peoples set the stage for later civilizations, but their creativity and originality deserve recognition on their own. They weren't just preparing for history, they were making it, one invention, one symbol, one stone circle at a time. The centuries between 5000 and 4000 BC were an age of invention, ambition, and revolution that would ripple across millennia. This was not a slow, quiet march of progress. It was a time when humans dared to push the boundaries of what was possible. Across continents, hammers rang on molten copper, cartwheels thundered over fresh-cut tracks, and colossal stones rose from the earth like sentinels of a new age. In bustling settlements and sacred landscapes, entire communities joined forces to build, trade, and innovate on a scale that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. From the gold-laden burials of the Varna elite to the awe-inspiring ziggurats of Mesopotamia, from the windswept stone circles of the north to the first rumble of wheels on axles, humanity was no longer content with mere survival. It was shaping civilization itself. This was the dawn of the spectacular. Around 4500 BC, the world's first wheels began to roll. Thick, solid wooden discs fixed to the sides of heavy carts. Evidence from Central Europe and Mesopotamia shows that this groundbreaking invention may have emerged in separate regions almost simultaneously. In the muddy lowlands of Mesopotamia, clay models depict wagons drawn by oxen, while in the forests of Europe, fragments of ancient wheels lie preserved in peat bogs. For the people of the time, this was nothing short of mechanical magic. The wheel turned the labour of transporting heavy loads from a back-breaking ordeal into an efficient, repeatable process. A farmer could now move stone for building, grain for storage, and timber for construction with far less effort. The wheel's arrival hinted at an emerging engineering mindset, the recognition that human ingenuity could bend the natural world to its needs. The first wheels were heavy, clumsy, and slow compared to what would follow, but they set something in motion that could never be stopped. In just a few centuries, the concept would spread, refined by craftsmen and adapted by new users, forever changing the scale of human ambition. On the windswept Outer Hebrides in Scotland, the Callanish stones began to rise from the earth around 4000 BC. These slender grey monoliths were set in a cruciform pattern with a central circle, each one towering against the northern sky. Their placement was not random. Some align with the moon's position during its rarest and most distant setting, a phenomenon that only occurs once every 18.6 years. To drag these stones into place without wheels or beasts of burden required raw human strength and extraordinary coordination. This was an engineering feat in its own right, but it was also an act of cosmic awareness. The people of Callanish were not merely building monuments, they were weaving their lives into the rhythms of the heavens. The stone circle likely served as both a ritual gathering place and a celestial calendar, helping farmers time their planting and harvests, and guiding the festivals that marked the turning of the seasons. To stand in its centre on a moonlit night must have felt like standing in the very heart of the universe. In southern Mesopotamia, around 4000 BC, a settlement named Uruk began to outgrow all others. What began as a modest riverside community swelled into the world's first true city, with sprawling neighbourhoods, monumental temples, and specialised districts for crafts and trade. The Anu Ziggurat and White Temple towered over the flat plains, visible for miles, a statement of both religious devotion and urban pride. But Uruk's influence came from more than its size. In its workshops, clay tablets began to appear covered with proto-cuneiform markings, the earliest known steps towards writing. These marks recorded transactions, labour and trade, transforming memory into permanent record. For the first time, human thought could be preserved beyond the moment. The streets of Uruk must have been alive with the sounds of artisans at work, maybe traders haggling, and labourers hauling goods. It was a place where human diversity and creativity converged, and where the concept of city life, dense, organised, and ever-growing, was born. In the highlands of Anatolia, settlements like Arslan Steppe became centres for a technology that would define the coming ages: large-scale copper smelting. Around the mid-5th millennium BC, these workshops fired up roaring furnaces, producing tools and weapons in quantities never before seen. The air around them must have been thick with smoke, heat, and the metallic tang of molten ore. This was no longer experimental tinkering. Copperworking had become a specialised craft. Control of this technology may have been the domain of the elites, marking the first steps towards craft specialisation and technological hierarchy. Copper's spread created new trade routes, as communities without ore traded food, textiles, or even labour for the gleaming tools of the metalworkers. This was the beginning of a new economic web that would soon span continents. On the Black Sea coasts of what is now Bulgaria, the Varna necropolis holds a secret unlike any other from this era. The oldest known worked gold in the world. Dated to around 4500 to 4300 BC, over 3000 gold artifacts were uncovered here. Delicate diadems and intricately carved beads. But the gold tells another story. Inequality had arrived. Some graves overflowed with treasures, copper tools, and even some exotic shells from far off shores, while others were simple and unadorned. This was a society where wealth and status had begun to crystallize, where power could be worn on the body and also carried to the afterlife. The shimmering ornaments of Varna were more than personal decoration. They were also symbols of connection and possibly divine favour. The people who wore them in life and death were announcing their place in a new social order. Across Anatolia and parts of the Balkans, the descendants of earlier Neolithic cultures continued a tradition that blurred the lines between home and temple. Houses were painted with vivid reds, blacks, and whites, depicting animals, geometric patterns, and human figures. In some, figurines of deities or ancestors stood in niches, watching over its inhabitants. Life here was not divided into ordinary and sacred. The heart was an altar, the walls were a canvas, and the floor a space where both work and ceremony could take place. These communities understood that identity and spirituality were built into the very spaces where people lived. Even as cities like Uruk rose and metalsmiths hammered copper into shape, smaller villages across the region held fast to this intimate, art-filled way of life, proof that progress took many forms. Between 5000 and 4000 BC, the world entered an age of bold experiments and unprecedented scale. The wheel rolled for the first time. Stone temples and circles aligned with the heavens. Cities rose from the riverbanks. Copper poured from furnaces, and gold gleamed in the graves of the elite. This was a millennium of visionaries. People who didn't just adapt to their environment, but reshaped it to match their ambitions. They left behind monuments that still stand as whispers from a distant age, reminders that even in 5000 BC, humanity's ambition knew no bounds. Around 4000 BC, the world stood at the threshold of a transformation unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. For millennia, scattered villages and farming communities had dotted river valleys and fertile plains, growing crops, tending animals, and living in small, largely self-sufficient groups. But in two places, the floodplains of the Nile and the alluvial lowlands of southern Mesopotamia, the tempo of history accelerated. Within a single millennium, human society leapt from scattered settlements to organised states, from local chiefs to kings who ruled as gods, from simple pictograms to full writing systems that could record laws, trade, and myth. The story of this age is a story of two civilizations rising in tandem, Egypt and Sumeria, the twin candles of human history. In the land of Sumer, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, the change came first. By 4000 BC, Villages had already begun to grow into larger centres, but what followed in the Uruk period was unprecedented. In the city of Uruk itself, the population swelled to perhaps 40 or 50,000 people, an astonishing number for the time, making it one of the first true cities in the world. Instead of clusters of huts, Uruk boasted districts of carefully laid mud brick houses, broad courtyards, and, most impressively, monumental temples. The great Iana precinct rose with its gleaming whitewashed walls and stepped platforms, dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war. Nearby, the Anu Ziggurat loomed, a terraced mountain of mud brick, one of the first massive ziggurats that would come to define Mesopotamian architecture. These were not the works of villagers, but a society already capable of organising immense labour forces, marshalling resources, and also sustaining specialist builders, priests, and administrators. This complexity demanded new ways of managing information, and here too Sumer broke ground. By around 3300 BC, the first clay tablets bearing proto-cuneiform signs appeared in Uruk. At first, they recorded nothing more than grain deliveries or flocks of sheep, simple tallies of goods. Yet in these wedge-shaped impressions lay the seeds of writing. Numbers gave way to symbols, symbols to words, and soon the Sumerians possessed a script capable not only of recording trade, but also of expressing names, myths, and even prayers. The world had entered the age of writing, and with it, the possibility of memory that could stretch beyond just the spoken word. Power in Sumer shifted accordingly. Priests who controlled the temple storehouses and rituals that connected the city to the gods wielded enormous influence. But by the late 4th millennium BC, kingship emerged alongside priestly rule. The Ensi, or rulers of city-states, combined religious legitimacy with military authority, claiming both the favour of the gods and the right to lead armies. Their palaces stood near the temples, forming a twin axis of spiritual and earthly power. To maintain their cities, they commanded not only soldiers but also farmers, craftsmen, and labourers. Irrigation canals stretched like veins through the land, distributing water from the great rivers into fields of barley and date palms, allowing harvests to feed tens of thousands. Metal, too, began to reshape the Sumerian world. The smelting of copper and the early alloying of bronze produced tools and weapons stronger than stone. Axes and ploughs improved labour. Spearheads and blades gave armies new lethality. With bronze in their hands and writing at their command, the Sumerians became the architects of urban civilization. Their influence spread far beyond their own cities, carried by trade caravans that reached into Anatolia for metals, into Iran for stone, and down the Gulf for exotic goods. By 3000 BC, southern Mesopotamia had become a web of bustling city-states, each competing, allying, and warring with the others, bound together by shared gods and shared innovations. While Sumer was building its cities of mud brick, Egypt was undergoing a transformation of its own. Along the Nile, farming villages had long clustered on the fertile strip of black soil left by the river's annual flood. By 4000 BC, cultures such as Nuqada were flourishing, their pottery painted in intricate designs, their tombs filled with goods that spoke of growing social divisions. Chieftains controlled stretches of the river, competing with rivals through both warfare and diplomacy. The Nile, unlike the unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates, offered regularity and abundance. Its dependable floods encouraged unity, for everyone drew life from the same river. Over the next millennium, these small kingdoms coalesced. Archaeology shows increasingly elaborate rituals, with the richest graves containing not just pottery, but also lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, gold from Nubia, and fine stone vessels carved with remarkable skill. Such goods speak of both wealth and long-distance exchange, and of rulers powerful enough to command resources far beyond these villages. Painted ceremonial palettes, such as the famous Narmer palette discovered at Hierakonpolis, show scenes of warfare and conquest, with rulers smiting their enemies and wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt. By around 3100 BC, these symbols became reality. The land of Egypt was unified under a single king, Narmer, who bound the two lands together and established the institution of the pharaoh. The unification of Egypt was not only political, but also ideological. Unlike Sumer's city-states, each competing for dominance, Egypt became a centralized kingdom under a ruler whose authority was absolute and divine. The pharaoh was not merely a king, but a god on earth, the living Horus, son of the god Ra. This gave Egypt a stability that Sumer never achieved. Where Mesopotamia fractured into rival polities, Egypt endured as a single kingdom, its unity embodied in the person of the pharaoh. With unification came new expressions of power. Monumental tombs, early mastabas, and later precursors of pyramids rose from the desert sands, built to house rulers for eternity. These were not just graves, but statements of ideology. In their scale and permanence, they declared the divine nature of kingship and the permanence of the state. Alongside them, temples grew, their walls adorned with carvings that depicted ritual, conquest, and the daily offering of order to the gods. Egypt's art and architecture crystallized during this period into forms that would endure for millennia. The canon of proportion, the iconography of gods and kings, the use of hieroglyphs as sacred writing. Hieroglyphs themselves emerged at the same age, around the time of unification. Like cuneiform, they began as pictorial signs, but in Egypt they quickly developed into a system capable of expressing complex ideas and religious concepts. On temple walls and ritual palettes, hieroglyphs gave permanence to words, fixing the king's deeds for all eternity. Writing was not merely practical bookkeeping here, it was sacred, bound up with ritual and kingship, a gift of the gods that reinforced divine rule. The economy of Egypt thrived under this system. Irrigation canals and basins directed at floodwaters, ensuring surplus harvests of wheat and barley. Surpluses fed not only farmers but also craftsmen, priests, soldiers, and many others. Specialized industries flourished. Stone carving, metalworking, pottery, linen weaving. Trade extended along the Nile to Nubia, and outward to the Sinai for turquoise, to the Levant for timber and resins, and across the desert routes for exotic goods. Just as in Sumer, Egypt was no longer a collection of self-sufficient villages, but a part of a networked world. As the third millennium approached, Egypt and Sumer stood as the two greatest powers of the age. They differed profoundly in environment and political organization, yet they mirrored each other in achievement. Both developed writing, both erected monumental architecture, both created states that could command vast numbers of people and resources. Yet their destinies diverged. In Sumer, the competition of the city-states bred innovation but also instability. leading to cycles of conflict and conquest. In Egypt, unity under divine kingship fostered continuity and monumental permanence. It is telling that while Sumer left us the world's first written epics, Egypt left us the pyramids. One civilization immortalized by its thoughts and another by its stone. Together they defined what civilization meant: organized government, writing, religion, monumental building, trade, and culture that transcended generations. By 3000 BC, humanity had stepped firmly into the world of history. The age of Egypt and Sumer was the age when human ambition coalesced to the world we know today. The 3rd millennium BC was the age when humanity crossed a threshold that it could never return from. The quiet river valleys of earlier millennia now roared with ambition. Stone monuments reached for the heavens, armies marched under banners of kings, and scribes pressed the memory of nations into clay and stone. Across the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Indus, humanity no longer lived with the land, it began to rule it. By 3000 BC, the earliest city-states of Sumer had already flourished for centuries. Villages had become cities, and cities had become centres of organised government, religion, and writing. Uruk, once a cluster of farming communities, was now a city of whitewashed temples and towering ziggurats. Clay tablets recorded the movement of goods, the payment of wages, and the laws of kings. Each symbol carved into wet clay marked not just an account, but the birth of history itself. In Sumer, the gods were everywhere. In the storms, in the rivers, the stars. Temples rose at the centre of each city, their terraces stacked high above the streets, as if climbing toward heaven. The priestly class managed food storage, trade, and ritual, binding religion and governance together. Around them, the world of the first urban cities unfolded. Merchants bartering in markets, scribes hunched over clay, and farmers hauling grain through city gates. Civilization had rhythm now, the ordered hum of an organised society. But in this crowded landscape, peace was rare. The same canals that brought life to the cities also sparked rivalry. Uruk, Lagash, Kish, each city sought dominance over the others. Stone stelae and clay inscriptions recorded wars fought not by raiders but by kings commanding professional armies. Around 2500 BC, King Anatunam of Lagash carved the victory of the steel of the vultures, showing ranks of soldiers marching in formation. Warfare had become institutionalized, and with it came the first empires. The dream of empire would soon be realized, a few centuries later by Sargon of Akkad, a figure both historical and mythic. Rising from humble origins, Sargon forged alliances, crushed rivals, and united the Sumerian city-states under a single banner at around 2300 BC. He called himself the King of the Four Quarters, the ruler of all lands under the heavens. From his capital in Akkad, he extended his power from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The Akkadian Empire became the first in recorded history, an organised, multi-ethnic state ruled by central authority. The world was changing fast. For the first time, people understood the scale of what human power could achieve. Bureaucrats managed taxation systems that reached across hundreds of miles. Armies were fed and equipped through state infrastructure. Royal daughters were married to neighbouring kings as a political strategy. Clay tablets from the time record not just business transactions, but also hymns, myths, letters. including some written by Enudana, the daughter of Sargon, who became the world's first known author. Yet the glory of Akkad was not eternal. Droughts, internal revolts, and invasions by nomadic groups known as the Gutians broke the empire apart. Around 2150 BC, the once mighty Akkad crumbled. But in its place, a new Sumerian power rose, the third dynasty of Ur. The city of Ur, rebuilt and expanded under King Ur-Nammu, became the capital of a renewed civilization. Its rulers developed the earliest known law code, predating Hammurabi's by centuries. The ziggurat of Ur, still standing in modern Iraq, remains a colossal testament to the ambition of this age, a mountain of brick built for the gods. While Mesopotamia rose and fell, another civilization on the banks of the Nile was reaching its zenith. Egypt's Old Kingdom, around 2680 to 2180 BC, was the age of the pyramid builders. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the early pharaohs had brought centuries of stability, allowing the kings to channel immense resources into construction of eternal monuments. The Step Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, designed by the architect Imhotep, was the first of its kind, a towering symbol of divine kingship. Soon, even greater ambitions took form. At Giza, Pharaoh Khufu commissioned a pyramid so vast it would remain the tallest human-made structure for nearly 4,000 years. Each block, each hall of stone, spoke of an organised society capable of staggering feats. Tens of thousands of workers, farmers during the flood season, laboured under the supervision of skilled artisans, engineers and priests. Contrary to old myths, they were not slaves but citizens working for rations, housing and the glory of their king. The Great Pyramids became more than a tomb. It was a declaration of Egypt's divine order, a monument to the belief that the pharaoh was a god on earth. Daily life in Egypt reflected this harmony between the divine and the practical. Along the riverbanks, farmers tended barley and emmer wheat, while fishermen and craftsmen supplied the markets. Scribes recorded harvests and taxation, their ink-stained reeds preserving a kingdom's memory. The Nile's steady rhythm made Egypt predictable in a way Mesopotamia never was. Where the Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably, often with destruction, the Nile's gentle rise and fall gave Egypt a sense of cosmic order. The concept of ma'at, balance, justice and harmony, shaped not only religion but governance itself. As Egypt's power grew, it extended its reach beyond its borders. Expeditions sailed south to Nubia for gold and ebony, east to Sinai for copper and turquoise. Across the desert, traders carried linen and papyrus in exchange for cedar from Lebanon or lapis lazuli from as far away as Afghanistan. The world was becoming interconnected, a network of trade that stretched across thousands of miles. But even divine kingdoms could falter. Around 2200 BC, Egypt's Old Kingdom began to fracture. Drought struck the Nile Valley, harvests failed, and provincial governors, the nomarchs, began to assert independence. The once unshakable Pyramid Age gave way to political chaos, marking the beginning of Egypt's first intermediate period. Yet even as the central state collapsed, the Egyptian spirit of order endured. Regional rulers maintained temples and tombs, preserving the memory of divine kingship until reunification, which would come again in the Middle Kingdom. Meanwhile, far to the east, another great civilization was flourishing, one shrouded in mystery. In the fertile plains of the Indus River Valley, Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro rose in geometric precision. Streets ran in perfect grids, lined with brick houses that had indoor plumbing and drainage systems, a marvel even by modern standards. The uniformity of weights, measures, and bricks across hundreds of miles suggests highly organised central authority. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, however, the Indus civilization left no grand monuments to kings or gods. Its script, still undeciphered, hides the secrets of its rulers and beliefs. What we can see speaks of a society deeply invested in urban life, trade, and balance. Seals bearing intricate animal motifs, unicorns, bulls, and elephants have been found as far west as Mesopotamia, showing that these cities were part of a vast commercial web. Ships likely sailed from the Indus Delta to Sumerian ports along the Persian Gulf, carrying timber, spices, and gemstones. The Indus world was peaceful, stable, and enduring, but by around 1900 BC, it too began to decline. Climate change, river shifts, and the gradual drying of the Saraswati River likely played a role. The cities were abandoned, their streets slowly reclaimed by dust and silence. Yet their legacy, urban planning, sanitation, and trade, would echo through every civilization that followed. As these river civilizations thrived, other regions stirred with new life. Across Anatolia and the Aegean, early Bronze Age cultures began to flourish. In Crete, the first Minoan settlements emerged, their palaces filled with painted frescoes and storerooms brimming with grain and oil. Trade connected the islands of the Aegean with Egypt and the Near East, forming a maritime network that carried not just goods, but ideas, writing systems, artistic styles, and myths. To the north, in the Eurasian steppe, new peoples mastered the horse and the wheel, transforming travel and warfare. Bronze weapons and chariots appeared, reshaping how battles were fought. This technological revolution, though gradual, marked the dawn of a new world, one where movement, migration, and conflict would define the coming centuries. By 2000 BC, the map of civilization looked very different from that of 1,000 years before. Empires had risen and fallen, but the foundations they built were unshakable. Writing had become the tool of kings and merchants alike. Monumental architecture dominated the landscapes of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Trade linked continents. The idea of the city, a permanent, organised, thriving centre of human life, was now the norm, not an exception. The 3rd millennium BC was not merely a chapter in history, it was the forging of civilization itself. In the deserts of Egypt, the temples and pyramids still stood as eternal symbols of divine kingship. In the plains of Mesopotamia, the ziggurats of Ur reached towards the sky. In the Indus Valley, the silent streets of Harappa bore witness to the power of order and community. Each of these civilizations faced challenges, droughts, invasions, internal strife, yet together they defined what it meant to be human, to build, to believe, to remember. The world had become connected by trade and ambition, but also by shared knowledge, metallurgy, architecture, writing, and art, all born from the same spark of ingenuity. And so, as the sun set on the year 2000 BC, humanity stood poised for its next great age. The old kingdom had fallen, the Sumerian cities had waned, and the Indus world had grown silent. But from their ashes would rise new powers, the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, the Babylonian empires of Mesopotamia, and far to the west, cultures that would one day give rise to Greece and Rome. The first empires had risen, the first kings had ruled, the first cities had sung with life. Civilization had proven itself resilient. The fire that, once lit, would never again go out. By 2000 BCE, humanity had entered a dangerous new chapter. The first great civilizations had already proven that organized societies could achieve monuments, writing, law, and long-distance trade. But they had also revealed a sobering truth. Complex worlds could fall apart just as quickly as they rose. The second millennium BC would be shaped not only by powerful empires, but by waves of collapse, migration, and reinvention. It was an age of kings and conquerors, of chariots and bronze, of written law and spoken prophecy. Across the ancient world, societies were tested by climate stress, warfare, and internal strain. Yet from those pressures emerged a new political system, new beliefs, and new ways of understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. At the start of the second millennium BC, the world was tightly connected by trade routes stretching from the British Isles to the Indus Valley. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the lifeblood of this interconnected system. Its production required access to distant resources, binding regions together in webs of exchange and diplomacy. Tin from Anatolia and Central Asia, copper from Cyprus, timber from Lebanon, and gold from Nubia moved across deserts and seas, carried by merchants whose journeys linked entire civilizations. Mesopotamia remained a cultural and economic heartland. After the fall of the Akkadian Empire centuries earlier, power had fragmented, but city-states endured. In southern Mesopotamia, Ur rose again under the third dynasty of Ur, creating a centralized bureaucracy that detailed written records documenting labor, rations, and taxation. These clay tablets reveal a world governed not just by kings, but by scribes and administrators who turned writing into an instrument of control. To the west, Egypt entered its Middle Kingdom period, marked by renewed stability after earlier fragmentation. Pharaohs ruled from the Nile Valley with an emphasis on order, justice, and balance, concepts embodied by the principle of Ma'at. Monumental building continued, but with quieter confidence than the Pyramid Age. Literature flourished, producing texts that explored morality, loyalty, and the hardships of ordinary life, suggesting a growing awareness of social responsibility and human vulnerability. One of the defining developments of this era was the formalization of law as a public institution. Around the early 18th century BC, King Hammurabi of Babylon commissioned a legal code that would become one of the most famous documents of the ancient world. Carved into stone and displayed publicly, the Code of Hammurabi laid out hundreds of laws governing trade, family life, property, and violence. While harsh by modern standards, the code reflected a powerful idea: that justice was not arbitrary, but structured, recorded, and overseen by the state. This concept of kingship was divinely sanctioned, yet legally bound, spread across the Near East. Rulers presented themselves as protectors of order rather than mere warlords. In Anatolia, the Hittite kings built a centralized state with treaties, archives, and a sophisticated legal tradition. Their capital, Hattusa, was fortified with massive stone walls and gates carved with lions and warriors, projecting power across the plateau. In the Levant, smaller kingdoms navigated the ambitions of larger neighbours. Cities such as Byblos, Ugarit, and Mari thrived as diplomatic hubs, preserving letters that reveal a world of alliances, marriages, betrayals, and constant negotiation. These archives show that international politics, complete with espionage and diplomacy, was already a deeply human enterprise. Technological change reshaped warfare during this millennium. The introduction and widespread adoption of the horse-drawn chariot transformed battlefields across Eurasia. Light, fast, and terrifying, chariots allowed elite warriors to dominate open terrain, making mobility and training as important as raw numbers. Military aristocracies emerged, tying political power to control of horses, weapons, and land. In Egypt, this transformation was driven by invasion. Around the mid-2nd millennium BC, groups known as the Hyksos entered the Nile Delta, bringing new military technologies, including composite bows and chariots. Their rule shocked Egyptian society, but also forced adaptation. When native Egyptian rulers eventually expelled the Hyksos, they emerged stronger, more militarized, and outward-looking. This shift laid the foundation for Egypt's later imperial expansion. Further east, the Kassites took control of Babylon, ruling for centuries with remarkable stability. Often overlooked, their reign preserved Mesopotamian culture, law, and religion during a time when political continuity was rare. Meanwhile, the Hittite emperor expanded aggressively, clashing with both Babylonian successors and Egyptian forces in one of the ancient world's most famous rivalries. Religion during this era reflected a world shaped by uncertainty. Gods were no longer distant forces alone. They were deeply involved in war, kingship, and disaster. In Mesopotamian literature, texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled and refined during this millennium, explored themes of mortality, friendship, and the limits of power. The story's enduring question, how humans face death in a fragile world, resonated deeply in an age of frequent upheaval. In Egypt, religious beliefs grew more inclusive. Ideas of the afterlife, once reserved for kings, expanded to include ordinary people. Coffin text and funerary practices spread beyond royal tombs, suggesting a democratization of spiritual hope. This shift reflected broader social changes, as individuals sought meaning beyond loyalty to rulers alone. In the Eastern Mediterranean, religious traditions evolved in quieter but more equally significant ways. Oral traditions emphasizing covenant, law, and ethical behavior began to take shape among emerging communities in the Levant, laying foundations that would profoundly influence later history. Despite frequent warfare, trade continued to bind civilizations together. Ships crossed the Mediterranean, carrying copper, wine, olive oil, and luxury goods. In the Aegean, Minoan Crete reached its height, with palace complexes like the Knossos serving as centers of administration. Frescoes depicted bull leaping, ships, and vibrant natural scenes, offering a striking contrast to the militarized cultures of the mainland. On mainland Greece, Mycenaean kingdoms rose. Their linear B tablets revealed bureaucratic systems tracking goods, land, and labour. Though often remembered for later legends, these societies were deeply embedded in the Bronze Age world, connected to Egypt and the Near East through commerce and diplomacy. Yet, this interconnectedness carried risks. When one link in the chain failed, the consequences rippled outward. Droughts, earthquakes, internal revolts, and invasions strained systems already stretched thin. By the late 2nd millennium BC, the entire Bronze Age network stood on the brink. Between roughly 1200 and 1000 BC, many of the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East experienced dramatic collapse. Palaces burned, cities were abandoned, and long-distance trade routes fell silent. The causes remain complex and debated, Climate shifts leading to famine, internal rebellions, technological changes, and waves of migrating or raiding groups, often called the Sea Peoples. The Hittite Empire vanished almost entirely. Mycenaean palaces fell and were never rebuilt. Egyptian records describe desperate battles against foreign invaders, even as the state itself weakened. Writing systems disappeared in some regions, ushering in centuries of relative obscurity. Yet collapse was not the end of civilization. It was a transformation. Smaller, more flexible societies emerged from the ruins. Iron technology began to spread, slowly replacing bronze and reducing dependence on fragile trade networks. New political forms took shape, adapted to a harsher, less centralized world. By 1000 BC, the ancient world looked very different than it had the millennium earlier. Empires had fallen, but ideas had endured. Writing, law, urban planning, and religious traditions survived, carried forward by new cultures ready to build again. The second millennium BC had tested humanity's ability to sustain complexity, and in doing so had prepared the ground for the next great chapters of history. This was an age not just of kings and conquests, but of endurance. Through collapse and renewal, humanity proved that civilization was not a single achievement, but a process, fragile, resilient, and endlessly reborn. The ancient world did not change slowly. It exploded. In just 1,000 years, bronze vanished, iron ruled, empires rose, and ideas were born that still govern our lives today. From Assyrian war machines to Roman law, from Greek philosophy to a child born under empire. This is the story of how the ancient world became ours. By 1000 BC, the ancient world was rising from the ashes of collapse. The great Bronze Age kingdoms had fallen, trade networks had shattered, and many cities had burned. Yet humanity did not retreat into silence. Instead, a new age was being forged, one harder, sharper, and more restless than before. Iron replaced bronze. Small kingdoms grew into empires. New religions, philosophies, and political systems reshaped how people understood power, duty, and the meaning of life itself. Between 1000 BC and 1 AD, the world was transformed more deeply than in any previous age. In the Near East, the early Iron Age began with recovery. Cities were rebuilt, trade routes reopened, and new peoples rose to power. Among them were the Assyrians, who turned warfare into a science. From their capitals at Ashur and later Nineveh, Assyrian kings built the most terrifying empire the world had yet seen. Their armies marched with iron weapons, siege engines, and disciplined formations. Relief carvings show cities under assault, walls collapsing, and captives led away. Fear itself became a political weapon. The Assyrians ruled through strength, deporting entire populations to prevent rebellion and binding the empire with roads, messengers, and centralized control. Yet, even this brutal empire could not last forever. By the late 7th century BC, internal rebellion and foreign invasion shattered Assyrian power. In its place rose the Neo-Babylonian Empire, famous for its king Nebuchadnezzar II. Babylon became a city of legend, with massive walls, monumental gates, and the mythic Hanging Gardens. It was also a city of learning. Astronomers charted the skies, priests recorded omens, and scribes preserved ancient knowledge that would shape future civilizations. To the east, in the highlands of Iran, another power was rising, the Persians. Under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC, Persia built an empire larger than anything before it. Unlike the Assyrians, the Persians ruled through tolerance. They allowed conquered peoples to keep their religions, customs, and local leaders, as long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. Royal roads crossed the empire from Anatolia to Central Asia, carrying messages faster than any previous system. Gold and silver coins made trade easier. Law, administration, and diplomacy became tools of empire as important as armies. While empires expanded in the Near East, new cultural forces were taking shape around the Mediterranean. In Greece, small city-states known as the polis emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age world. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes developed different political systems: monarchy, oligarchy, tyranny, and democracy. In Athens, citizens debated laws in public assemblies. In Sparta, society became a permanent military camp. Greek culture flourished in poetry, drama, sculpture, and philosophy. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle asked questions no civilization had ever asked so deeply before. What is justice? What is truth? What makes a good life? These ideas would outlive every Greek army, yet Greece itself was rarely peaceful. City-states fought constantly, weakening themselves just as a new power rose in the north, Macedon. Under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great, Greece was united by force. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed into Asia and began one of the greatest conquests in history. In little more than a decade, he destroyed the Persian Empire, marched through Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iran, and into India. Wherever he went, Greek culture followed. Cities were founded. Greek became the language of government, and Eastern and Western ideas blended into a new world called the Hellenistic Age. After Alexander's death, his empire split into rival kingdoms, but his cultural impact never faded. Science, medicine, mathematics, and geography advanced rapidly. In Alexandria, scholars measured the size of the earth, mapped the stars, and preserved ancient texts in the greatest library of the ancient world. Far to the west, another small community was beginning its own rise. Rome, once a village on the Tiber River, grew into a republic ruled by elected officials and a powerful senate. Roman society valued discipline, law, and loyalty to the state. Through centuries of warfare, Rome conquered Italy, then clashed with the mighty Carthaginian Empire in the Punic Wars. Hannibal's elephants marched across the Alps, but in the end, Rome destroyed Carthage and became master of the Western Mediterranean. Rome did not simply conquer, it absorbed. Conquered peoples became citizens, soldiers, and taxpayers. Roads, aqueducts, and cities spread across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Roman law shaped daily life, defining rights, duties, and justice. Yet power brought conflict. Civil wars erupted as generals fought for control. In the 1st century BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and shattered the Republic. After his assassination, years of chaos followed, until his adopted son Octavian emerged victorious. In 27 BC, he became Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic was gone, and empire had begun. While Rome ruled the Mediterranean, great civilizations also thrived elsewhere. In India, the Mauryan Empire under Ashoka ruled much of the subcontinent in the 3rd century BC. After witnessing the horrors of war, Ashoka embraced Buddhism and ruled through moral law rather than fear. His edict, carved into stone pillars, preached compassion, tolerance, and peace. In China, the Warring States period ended when the Qin dynasty unified the land in 221 BC. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, standardized laws, writing, weights, and roads. He began the Great Wall and was buried with the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers meant to guard him in death. Though the Qin dynasty was short-lived, it created a foundation for the Han Empire, which followed and ruled for centuries. Under the Han, China developed bureaucracy, trade, paper, and the early Silk Road, linking east and west through commerce. Trade became one of the defining forces of this age. Roman glass has been found in China. Chinese silk was worn by Roman elites. Spices, ivory, gold, and ideas travelled thousands of miles. Along with goods came stories, beliefs, and technologies. The world, for the first time, was quietly becoming global. Religion and philosophy also changed profoundly. In the Middle East, Jewish tradition emphasized one God, law, and moral duty. In India, Hinduism and Buddhism shaped spiritual life. In China, Confucianism taught order, duty, and respect, while Taoism sought harmony with nature. In the Roman world, old gods were still worshipped, but new mystery cults and spiritual movements spread, searching for personal meaning in a vast empire. As Rome tightened its grip on the Mediterranean world, its power stretched even into the small, restless province of Judea. Ruled by client kings like Herod the Great and watched closely by Roman governors, the land was filled with tension between empire and tradition, between law and prophecy, between power and fate. Jewish society at the turn of the era lived with deep expectations. Ancient texts spoke of a coming Messiah, a figure who would restore justice and free the people from oppression. It was in this charged world, sometime in the final years before the calendar turned, that a child named Jesus was born in the region of Judea. His birth passed almost unnoticed by the great powers of the age. No armies marched, no cities fell, yet stories spread among shepherds, families, and villages that something extraordinary had begun. In a world ruled by emperors and kings, this child entered history without a crown, palace, or an army. As the century turned, Rome continued to dominate the known world, unaware that its greatest challenge had not come from rebellion or invasion, but from ideas. The life and teachings of Jesus would unfold in the years ahead, beyond the edge of this era, carried not by legions but by word of mouth and belief. Thus, the age from 1000 BC to 1 AD closed not with conquest but with quiet. Empires had risen and fallen, iron had replaced bronze, law, philosophy, and trade had reshaped humanity, and in a small corner of the vast empire, a story had begun that would soon change the course of history itself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.